Hey there, day 2 of TogetherCon. We are here with what? Oh my god, I don't remember what the product. It's a comics panel. It's about getting started with comics and a brief introduction. If you have any questions, please let us know. We are doing this virtual convention, so if you're watching online, you can also pop over here. A lot of fun. Cool. Well, we're gonna do our introductions, and I'm gonna go with my compatriot first.
Hello, this is Alice, and I have been a comics fan essentially since I was a kid. However, not through actual comics themselves, mostly through the other forms of entertainment that spawned from comics, such as the watching reruns of the '60s Spider-Man show, the '60s Batman show, the '70s and '80s Bill Bixby, Lou Ferrigno, Incredible Hulk. It was a very big part of my childhood. And then proceeding onward with the cartoons, we would see the '90s: Batman, X-Men, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Incredible Hulk. There's a long list.
Yeah.
So yeah.
All right, cool. I'm gonna put my glasses on because I have an outline because it helps me not feel overwhelmed. Hi there, everyone. I am ThiaTheGard. I am a content writer and part of the admin team here for RWoG Gaming. Very excited to be here. You can find me gaming on every first and third Saturdays for TNT. The name changes all the time. And it is a Dungeons and Dragons game. It's a lot of fun. And then Sundays, we have Malhaven, and we have That Which Can Eternal Lie, which are two different TTRPGs with different systems. They're great. All of these can be found at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you don't hate the sound of my voice, you can come hang out with me and my friend Pat at our podcast called Those Meddling Kids. We watch horror movies with you, so you don't watch them alone. We're your new best friends. And that's great. um, my pronouns are she, they, but I just learned about they, she last night, so it's probably going to lean more towards that. But it is nice to meet you all. And like Solid said, my history with comics uh, did start more so with different kinds of media. I lived in a very small town. We didn't have like a drugstore with the cool spinny thing with the comics on it. So I started with 1960s Batman reruns, with Wonder Woman reruns, things like that. In fact, one of my earliest memories is telling my mom that I wanted to be Catwoman because we hadn't gotten to Batgirl being in the series yet. And there probably should have been a lot more concern than there was. Um, and then as we got into the 90s, there was this wonderful plethora of shows and movies that came out that really did help solidify me loving these superheroes and finding inspiration for them. Um, but yeah, I didn't get to have my little grubby hands touch comic books or get into comic shops until I was in college in the early 2000s. And then I was kind of too broke to buy comics, but like, it was neat that it was there and available. um, and my first experience wasn't great there. But I think it is important to note that then, after a lull, I did go to different comic shops, and my experiences at these other comic shops have been great. People have been helpful, or they've left me alone, which I think honestly is kind of what I like more. I kind of just like to raccoon scurry through things and find what I like. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Um, but I do remember what it was like to not have that great distraction. That not having a great first time in a store. And as I let those years pass and then got more comfortable with going into these stores and getting into comic books, I always kind of wanted to make sure that if I could do something to help other people not feel so overwhelmed, by the amount of history and amount of comics and what are you going to go find, I would. Which brings us to today with this panel, where we're going to talk a little bit about how to get into comics and the history of them and some of our experiences with it. Feel free to ask questions or to chime off in the panel room. I will try to watch both because I don't have a, a a PowerPoint, so it'll be easy. Um, so let's see. Let,
For me
go ahead.
myself, when I actually did start collecting
Yeah,
comics,
please do.
um, my first experience with actually getting my hands on a comic was I was in like third or fourth grade, and this was early mid 90s. So we're talking like 93, 94, essentially, is what I remember correctly. And basically, where I lived at that time was there was a pharmacy like a block or two away, and had the classic spinning rack. This is the ancient lost era of comic book where you could actually just go into a place. There was a rack of comic books like there is a rack of magazines and just buy single issues of comic books. And so my mom bought me some because she knew I was always watching cartoons and stuff like that. And so for the first ones I ever got was I actually remember the third one because me and Thea were talking about this stuff and pre-panel. I remember the third one that just clicked in my head. The first one that I remembered was a issue of Thor where Spider-Man was teaming up with him, and it was like Spider-Man and Thor taking on Absorbing Man and the Titania. And then there was a time when the Thing from Fantastic Four had a solo run, and this was one where he
Nice.
ran into Ghost Rider and fought Ghost
Mhm.
Rider. And then the third comic that I remembered was the it turned out being the part two of the debut of Carnage. So his first time ever showing up in comics whatsoever, and it was part two of his debut. And so those are the earliest ones. And then it wasn't like years and years, and those comics were long gone, destroyed because you're a kid. You don't value or
Yeah.
protect things. Well, not all kids. Some kids do that. I wasn't one of them.
I
And
think it's
so
also like, what are you taught how to, or are you taught to value these comics as something more than this is my thing that I have right now? And
yeah.
not all parents, if your parents aren't into comics, then how are you going to know to be like, yeah, I want to preserve this and not just I want to consume in a childlike manner?
No, yeah. And so it wasn't until Kelly Sue run was announced for Captain Marvel, which is when Carol Danvers went from Ms. Marvel to Captain Marvel, and that's when I was like, okay, you know what? I want to check this out. It's being written by a woman. It's a kick-ass character that I enjoyed in like Marvel Ultimate Alliance. It was video games were also another part of how I got access
Mm-hmm.
to my comics, like the two PlayStation One Spider-Man games.
Oh,
Fantastic game.
yeah.
That was also a big thing. So I'm like, you know what? I'm actually gonna go to a shop and I'm actually gonna do a pull list for the very first time ever. I want this series, and then I got Thor. Jason Aaron's was starting around the same time. I'm like, I want this stuff. Let's go. I'm gonna give it a shot. So that's when I actually got my hands on actual comics. Comics. Other than that, it was mostly cartoons and video games was my main source of getting to comics on my end. So
Yeah. I think mine. So I came back to it at a free comic book day. I went with my roommates, and I was really nervous, and I just went to a section by myself, and I think just went for Batgirl because she was one of the first comic book superheroes that I knew of. Um, and I considered myself very much a Marvel at that time because I was consuming a lot of the Marvel movies, a lot of the shows on Netflix and things like that. But I think I just wanted to find that comfort and found one that I liked and was very excited. Um, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about how we like to choose our comics, which will tie into some things that will be said in the panel room about how much money comics cost and how many comics there are. So let's talk
Yeah, where
very briefly about the history of comics. And I mean it when I'm telling you this is brief. I wrote a paper in college about comics in post World War II America and how it was as a medium of art reflecting our society. And that was multiple pages. And that was in 2007. So we've had even more since then. Um,
yeah, you could even go like if like for example, I think Sci-Fi Channel. There's several
gosh,
documentaries
I
that are like an
know.
hour, 2 hour long documentaries. If you define documentaries on the history of comic
Yeah,
books, so yeah, everything that Thea is about to go over, that is like it's literally a drop in the bucket in terms of
yeah.
full depth of the history of the comic book industry. It is insane.
This is super duper brief. Um, so comics have been around for a very long time. The first actual comic book, which we will say was a comic book because it said comics book on it, and that was published in 1897, and it was Yellow Kid in McFadden's Flats. Yeah, 1987. um,
Reverse it, 1897.
oh, thank you, 1897. Everybody here knows I have dyslexic. Those of you at home, I have dyslexia. So thank you, Solid. This is why Solid also has the outline, because there are numbers in this one. Yesterday's
Drafty
didn't.
numbers.
Um, Now this one wasn't any of the superheroes that like we know and love. So if you want to kind of skip ahead to someone who is kind of familiar, that would be in March of 1937. And that was when the company that would become DC gave us Slam Brady, um, who is basically the forebearer and like the prototype for Superman. And that's not uncommon. There's a lot of characters who you get someone who's a lot like a character that's very popular now. And it's basically that they kind of looked at that character and were like, we could make this something. It actually happens a lot. And sometimes it gets a little bit confusing, like with Shazam and Mr. Marvel and
Oh
all
god,
things like that. Yeah.
that's a headache. That's a headache.
Yeah,
That story's a headache.
it is. It is. Um, that this comic's also very important because it gives us a dream team and basically like the great granddaddies of so much of comics. And that is Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Um, if you don't know them, don't be upset. They're only really just starting in like the last 10 years to be getting the credit that they really are due for what they've done in comics. For a
Another,
while, it
yeah,
was kind of,
another
I don't
running
know.
theme in the comic books industry
Yeah.
where rights and credit to, like for example, Bill
Yes.
Finger. Bill Finger was a huge
Hmm.
contributor to Batman, but we
Yeah,
only ever heard about Bob Kane.
exactly.
So it's like, yeah, it's a thing.
Yeah, it is unfortunately a thing. But the cool thing is also that a lot of fans who know stuff are like, hey, but what about so and so? And there's also a lot of folks who are fans of comics and who have been fans of comics who are now in the industry or who are making documentaries, who are making specials that go on HBO, who go on Disney Plus, the History Channel and things like that. And they are pushing for these names and these persons to be recognized, which is fantastic. And also, yeah, if you're looking for some really cool documentaries, check out Disney Plus if you're into Marvel. Check out HBO Max if you're into DC because
Wasn't it? Yeah, it was a book that managed to get Bill Finger the credit he deserved, right?
it
Someone,
was.
yeah, someone
I
wrote a
can't
book
remember who it
about.
was. Yeah.
Yeah, but there was a book that writing
Hmm.
about what Bill Finger did for Batman, and then it's like that started a tidal wave, so to speak, or
Yeah.
the dice roll of, oh hey look, I'm sorry, domino roll of
Yeah.
like,
I know what you mean.
hey, hang on a second, this is someone who actually helped to create one of the most popular superheroes of all time.
Yeah.
No one, I had no clue. I was like,
Yeah.
who? What?
I
And I'm
know.
like, and then I was like, Bob Kane, you motherfucker.
I know. Bobbert, how could you?
It was like,
Stand
what?
in the corner. Alfred would be disappointed. Oh, said I like that one. She's like, "Oh, we're judging someone?" Yes. Um, Batman, as we were just saying, really isn't that far behind. Detective Comics comes out almost a year later, not even with him. And now comics were for everyone back then. Like, there really wasn't any censorship on it. It was just you could go pick up a comic. And they were for children, for adults. In fact, comics were also very much used during World War II. If you remember in the Captain America First Avenger movie, like, that's real. They were using comics in the posters and the buy your war bonds and sign up and Rosie the Riveter, Wonder Woman. These heroes were being used very heavily during World War II, and comics, both from what would become DC and Marvel, were being shipped overseas as part of care packages for soldiers. Um, and that was fine. But it also gave us a lot of like very dark comics. There were detective stories, like I said, but those had a lot of murder. They
Horror.
also
Yep, there's
there
horror
was
comics. Yep.
yeah there were horror comics. Um, there wasn't a lot of censorship of sexual content in comics. So by the time we get to 1954, America is going through a big shift. Um, there were some gentlemen in charge, or who wanted to be more in charge, who were trying to bring folks that they thought were communists, um, homosexuals, queer, and bringing them to court. And unfortunately, with these very real persons, also came comics. And not even just like Wonder Woman or Batman and Robin, um, but the horror comics and the detective comics. So, what we got from that was censorship that became to the enforcement of the comics code. Very long story short, the censored comics for violence and any other kind of unseemly content, so sexual content, homosexual content, BDSM, all
It
sorts
even
of
went
things like that.
even went as far as saying that you could not have, for example, a bad cop. So, like, let's say,
Yeah.
a crime story where there's a cop who has been bribed. You cannot have
Hmm.
that because you cannot have negative views of authority figures such as law enforcement, things like that. The Comics
Yeah.
Code Authority, which was the full and specific name of what it was, that was
Hmm.
essentially when comics went through the era of what video games went through a couple years ago with Jack Thompson. Except that
Yeah.
this actually did go through with government stuff, government regulation, and this was like a way for the industry to try to self-regulate to avoid hardcore censorship and control by the government at that time, and could
And
get really specific and detailed with it.
and it really wasn't even lifted until kind of recently, if you're looking at like the history of comic books and things like that. It went on for a very, very long time. I think even including into our lives, Solid and I's. Um, but there were people who just kind of were like, about it. Um, and so normally what you would have to do is you would submit the comic to someone in authority, and then you would get stamped with the seal of approval or with the comics code. Um, excuse me. In Marvel, there was a newer artist who was really coming up in storyteller teams, and Stanley was a big part of that team. And so he had written and was working on a story, and it was done. And he was like, I can't even submit it to his wife. She asked him why, and he was like, they're never going to do it. It's never going to get published. And she was like, so why don't you just publish it? What's going to happen? And that famously is how Marvel started to publish comics without the comics code of approval.
AKA,
Um,
they were like, ha 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 ha.
Screw you. You're not my mom. um,
I do what I want.
yeah. And eventually the code would be lifted. And this really was able to bring in a breath of new life into both of the main franchises at the time, which was Marvel and DC. And then later we get companies like Dark Horse and more independent ones, which are fantastic. Um, and that brings us into a lot of different eras of comics that get a little bit darker, get a little bit grittier. that we
Just
don't need to
variations
talk
of the
about too
90s.
much, the Dark Ages.
Of the 90s, yeah, we don't want it's like we don't talk about
We don't like
Bruno, we
that.
don't talk about
We
Fight
don't talk
Club, and we don't talk about the 90s.
no. um, but comics, like everything else, go through a lot of changes at that point in time, and they go through some growing pains, which is fine. But through all of it, our heroes prevail. And like we were saying in the beginning, one of the great things that comes from this is that we get new shows that aren't so campy, like the Kapow, Bam, 1960s Batman. Um, and
To be fair,
you're,
I like the Kapow moments.
I
It was the other stuff
do.
around it that was kind of like, if you watch it now, it's like, okay, you have to admit that it is, or you actually you
Mhm.
have to accept you're
Yeah,
about to watch a super campy
yeah,
thing that is just
yeah.
like, okay, it's like if you don't have that acceptance in your mind, if
Then you're
it
gonna be
feels
like, what kind of Batman is this? And we put respect on Adam West's name in this house. And most of my favorite Catwomen are from that show,
oh, mine too, but for different
right?
reasons. Different reasons. I was a growing boy at the time. I like Julie
um,
Newmar and them hips. Oh man.
he's my number one favorite Catwoman.
Yeah. Eartha Kitt too.
She's my
She's
number two.
amazing.
She's
She's
my number
amazing.
two. Yeah.
Mad
Um,
respect for those ladies.
yeah. We could talk about that all day. Favorite Catwomen. Um, but this helps bring us into this current age of Marvel that we have, where we have the MCU, and where we have the DCU, which is definitely going through some growing pains right now. Solid talked about that a little bit on his panel. There's some new stuff happening, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but that's not what this panel's about.
That's like a whole
So
new
we're
panel itself. Yeah.
yeah, we're not gonna. But yeah, we are getting all of this fantastic comic book content in different mediums and different materials, which are bringing in new fans, which is fantastic. But that brings us to questions that we had in the panel, which was, how do I get into comics? Like Vaughn was saying, there are just so many of them and they're expensive. And we had another person talking about a way that we were both talking about it. Um, So your childhood was in the 90s? The 90s. Yeah, my childhood was also in the 90s. I was born in the late 80s. Um, it was a rough time in comics, y'all. Um,
Oh God.
yeah,
The crash.
the crash. I know.
The crash.
Um,
And then
there also was another crash very recently in the early 2000s, and I think that's something that a lot of people are forgetting is that like Marvel was bankrupt very recently.
that yes, Marvel going bankrupt in the
Yeah.
late 90s, early 2000s was basically part of the reason why they made deals that they did with for Blade, X-Men,
Mhm.
Spider-Man. So,
Yeah.
Sony having control of Spider-Man still now,
Mhm.
that is due to Marvel being in complete financial
Yeah.
like shittery at that time.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah. So, like, this is all very modern history for us as comic fans and for people who are watching these shows and these movies and stuff and being like, but why can't we have Andrew and Toby in all of the movies? um, so, we're going to talk a little bit about how we think you can get into comics. And part of my answers are easy and they're not going to make some other people happy, which is okay. Um, what I found is, who's your favorite? You're watching these movies, you're watching these shows, you might be looking at like web comics or like Wayne Family Adventures, whatever it is. Um, and I think that's one of the first questions to ask yourself. Who do I like? Whose story am I interested in? Who do I see myself as? Okay, Vaughn saying Bucky Barnes. I know Malcolm said somebody there. Oh, you liked Vertigo, Sandman's thing. Yeah, oh, they're good too. And then there are some different ways to look at it. There's a couple different ways to research who you like and how that's going to help you go and find the comics that you want. So some of that can be done by going online and looking on like a wiki or going on the websites themselves. And there are other, like, wikis will give you whole comics and whole runs and things like that that you can find a character and be like, yeah, okay, cool, I want to look at that. And then you have some other sites too, Solid, that you were listing the other day.
Yeah. So when it comes to researching for, yeah, part of it is like, hey, pick a character that you're into. Sometimes it could be some of the classic ones that we all know of in the mainstream.
Mhm.
Sometimes maybe a new character gets introduced into, like for example, Moon Knight series is just hit. So maybe someone's curious about Moon Knight. Well, one thing you do is okay, you go to the not just the Wikia page of
Mhm.
standard Wikipedia, the other one, the fandom page or the fandom site of Marvel, and a lot of times you can type in a superhero's name and it will bring up a disambiguation, which it shows you, okay, here's the main comic book universe of that character, here's an alternate universe of that character, and even listing each every single one, and depending on if the characters had appearances in cartoons, it will list which cartoons they've
Because
appeared
Moon
in.
Knight's been in a few. Yeah.
And so, yeah, you can use that as a guide to help you just focus on where it is you're looking for. And then as you're reading through these characters' histories, sometimes, oftentimes, actually, I should say, an event will have the links, the classic, bibliographic references or sources, and now it tells you which comic issues they're talking about. And
Mhm.
you just follow the breadcrumbs, or sometimes, depending on the character, go down the rabbit hole deeper and
Oh,
deeper,
yeah.
and then
Because
you'll be
some of
able to
these characters
find,
have been
yeah.
around since like 38, 39.
Yeah, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, for example, that's the 30s, and then you have the Marvel universe as we know it, the 616 universe,
Mm-hmm.
which is from the 60s.
Yep.
So it's like there, and then you have some of the crazier stuff like Spider-Man's what hasn't he hit like the 800 mark
I
in terms
think
of his
so.
books? So
Yeah.
there is so
He's
much
had
to go
so
through.
many titles.
Yeah. So these are ways that using those sites are ways that you can use that to sort of focus where your research is going. There's also another thing that I was talking about strategy of using um, specific characters fan sites or
Yep.
properties fan sites. For example, if you're into Spider-Man, one site I would recommend is the Spider-Man crawl space. It is a site that's completely dedicated to Spider-Man and all of his history. Um, and so it even has a podcast that goes along with it. And so not only will that provide information, there you can listen to the podcast to get information on, like, they have fun segments like this month in Spider history, which like will pick, like, let's say the April one. So pick a year that Spider-Man was running and then go through every comic that Spider-Man released of in April of that year. So you can use that to help you as a guide. And also these sites a lot of times will have news as well as other general comic book news sites. A lot of times they will talk about upcoming releases. So, for example, if you're into Aliens, Predator, or Aliens versus Predator, if you're on one of the Alien or Predator or AVP websites, then chances are they're going to list what the latest news about the upcoming releases of Alien versus Predator comics, and you can use that to help you. And then you at least have a name that you can then look up and
Mhm.
research, or walk into a comic shop. Hey, I'm looking for this specific thing. 'Cause that's
Yeah.
how I did it. I mean, Thea mentioned
Yeah.
that she had a rough time with the first shop she went to. Now I have certain, like, naturally I have an advantage because I am a CS heterosexual male. So I clearly would have some advantages and privilege in that type of arena. But either way, I still look, hey, look, I want this.
Yeah.
And same thing, that's how I said when I was looking, creating a pull list to get my hands on the Kelsu Deconic Captain Marvel #1. I'm like, I want this. I don't need to ask no questions. I already know what I'm looking for. Give me. So these are some things you can use to help you focus, narrow, and do research to narrow down something that you're specifically looking for, specifically want.
Yeah. So now let's talk about the money a little bit. Let's talk about economics behind comic books and what your purchase means. And let's talk about the pull list first. Or unless you can take a drink and I can talk about a different place to get them. Um,
No, I'm sipping. That's okay. I'm just
yeah.
sipping. But I saw the conversation earlier when you guys talked about, oh, I'm a coffee person, I'm a tea person, I'm a tequila person. So
Good, good. That's what we need in this conversation. I'm getting hyped
yeah.
up on Coke. So,
Oh,
Cola.
Don't do
yeah.
drugs.
Coca-Cola. Don't do drugs,
Like I'm on
please.
Coke. I'm like,
Oh
whoa,
my
hold up.
god. I know. I just remember
You're
this
not
is
even
gonna
sharing.
end up on this is gonna end up on YouTube later and Twitch. No, we are not
Like,
saying to do drugs. Please don't.
are
We
you
are
stingy?
approved by the Comics Code.
I'm one of the first ones told him to go fuck off. Like, anyway, anyway,
Yeah.
so the reason I was laughing when she brought up the economics involved in comics was because I prefer the meme of like that goes around, which is like, hey parents, don't worry about your kids doing drugs, cause get them hooked on comics or Warhammer 40K, and they'll never have enough money for anything. And that is probably the most true thing. Crack is probably cheaper than getting
Yeah.
comics sometimes. So the reason why we bring that is because, well, unfortunately, it was like 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit more than 10 years ago, they had the latest price hike in comics. So um, if you go looking to purchase single issues, which are typically monthly issues, that one little thin 25-page book that comes out once a month, that's $4 a pop.
Yeah.
And in your head, you're like, $4 for that? Are you fucking kidding me? It's like, do I get the superpowers when I read that shit? It's like, no,
We should.
don't. We should, yeah. So and so it's like it's one of those things where that number can add up and it can add up quickly.
Yeah.
So if you're like myself, my ass is poor. So it's one of those things where you start to have to be very considerate about what it is you're doing. Um, in fact, I mentioned earlier about the Spider-Man Crawl Space podcast. Well, several of them, which I was listening to this podcast when the price went up to 4, and several of them said they basically dropped all of the comics they pull except for the Spider-Man books because they read that for the podcast. That's their material. That's the material you're supposed to be reading for the
Yeah.
show. So it's like that tells you something in terms of the pricing. Um, this is also a relevant, I'm sorry, not irrelevant, but relevant in the sense that if you are listening to this or you're going to listen to this in the future and you have children that you're going to get into comics or that want to get into comics, something like that, this type of price scenario, price information is going to be very relevant for you as well. Because otherwise you're burning up you're going to burn through your money pretty fast with a couple of books at $4 a
Yeah.
pop. You know what I mean? So that is a thing.
But we do
Um,
also, if we
mhm.
can support our local shops and we can get our pull list and we can do that, then that's important and that's great because, like we were saying, there have been crashes and it's been very difficult for some of these shops. And they really want to help new gamers, new comic fans to be able to share that passion. Um, you like to help people find them, Menachem, partnering with a comic shop. That's awesome. Yeah. Um, but so we do have some tips for if that's not economically feasible for you right now. And one of them was also mentioned in the panel room earlier, and that is your local library. When I first got back into comic books, I was working in a library, and you're working in a library right now.
Yeah.
And you can do an awesome thing at your library where you can get comics. A lot of times there will be comics for kids up in the children's section, and then there'll be the other comics in different spots. In the graphic novel section usually. Uh, and if your library doesn't have that comic, you can put in a request for a hold, which means that then they will go and they will look through their system and see who can get it. And then sometimes you have to go through a different loan situation, but you can get your hands on uh, comics that way. And that is a fantastic way to be able to keep your income, but also to be supporting the comic industry and to be reading comics for yourself, which is a lot of fun. And it gives you a little bit of leeway with how do I really like this? You know, is this art style going to be for me? Is this run? Is this writer? Um, so that's a really great and fun way to be getting into comic books. um, And then, like Solid was saying, go to your local shop if you can. Um, if the person behind the counter is busy, there are other people there. They want to talk comics. They want to talk shop. Um, or ask your friends who like comics. Like, if you're my new friend and you're like, wow, I really don't know what to read, be like, hey, Thea, I like Gwen Stacy from Into the Spider-Verse. Where can I start? um, and I will happily help you out. Look for friends, look for other nerds. And it also helps because if you find the right people in fandom, it makes it more fun because then you have people to geek out with. Um, but yeah, go to your local shop. And sometimes there are days like International Comics Day, which is coming next month, very soon. I think it's the 7th this year.
Yeah, typically it's the
Um,
first, if I recall, it's the
yeah,
first Saturday of May every year.
yeah. So I think it is.
Um, and a lot of times for the publishers, they will include as part
Mm-hmm,
of that free comic book day is they will have actual comics produced specifically for that day.
mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's anthologies, which is preview anthologies actually,
Yeah,
where here's like the first few pages of several upcoming books that they're going to be releasing in the
which
future.
is so
So
cool. Yeah.
so that's a really great way for you to be able to get some kind of a taste of what is to come, which can help to again guide you,
Mm-hmm.
give you like helps to narrow down the options and the choices, and give
Yeah.
you like, okay, I want to try, I want this, I want to actually specifically want this thing. Mhm.
I could not recommend going to International Comics Day at your local shop more. Uh, I know with COVID, it's kind of scary to be going out to places now, but I think this year I am going to try to go if I can. I didn't go the last 2 years, but I do want to help out my local shop, support them. And sometimes there are deals, sometimes, like Solid said, there are special books. And it's just cool. It's just fun. You know, it's fun to kind of almost have like a little nerdy, geeky holiday with other people who are like, yeah, I love this, you know. Sometimes they have cosplayers. Like the first one I went to, it was a bigger shop and they had the 501st there, who are these really cool organization that does a lot of like bad guys, like the stormtroopers and stuff like that
Oh,
from,
is that the Star Wars group that goes and dresses up
yeah,
here at places? Yeah, yeah, I know those
yeah, yeah,
folks.
yeah.
I love
Oh,
them.
thank you, Menachem, for putting the link in the chat. I'll put it up on the Twitch later. Um, but yeah, they come and they do charitable stuff at different organizations, and they were at mine, and they were like, you know, pretending to shoot people and like, you know, doing things for charity and like taking pictures. Like it was so cool. And the other neat thing is that like these are fans, like they make their cosplays all themselves. It's they're really really cool folks. Um, so I went to this place being very scared about going to a comic book shop after having a bad experience. Was greeted by an actual stormtrooper who escorted me into the building, and then just had a really good time and got a lot of comics. um, your store has artists and players. Yeah, a lot of Alley Cat Comics in Chicago. Why so far, Menachem? But yeah, shout out for Alley Cat
Why
Comics
so
in
close to
Chicago.
me?
There you go.
I'm in the Chicagoland area. That's why I say
Yeah,
that.
I know. I watched you go like Chicago. um, but yeah, for those of you who are watching this on YouTube or going to watch it later on Twitch, if you're in the Chicago area, go hook up Alley Cat Comics. It sounds like they're really great, and Menachem's a friend of mine, and I very much trust his opinions. Um, but yeah, Free Comic Book Day, International Comic Book Day, good stuff. Aw, shucks, Menachem.
And
Um,
if you're in our area, make sure you go to Lansdale and go to Comic
yep.
Zen, one of our big sponsors and a really good friend of ours.
I was just being like, yeah, thank you, Crimson. Crimson's the best. Yeah. Um, Comic Zen, they are great folks. They have done so much with us here at Real Women of Gaming. Um, cool, nerdy people finding cool, nerdy, like-minded people. That's what we're doing here. um, so those are some ways that you can start getting into it. Like I said, I just really like being able to go sometimes and look at books and look at racks and be like, I like that art. Ooh, I don't like that art, because not every artist run is going to be the same. Or you can kind of get a feel for like, what's the verbiage going to be like? And it's okay to take time in your local comic book shop. It's okay to take time in your library. Look at things. Figure it out. Get a feel for what you like. And if you don't like something in that run, you'll find one. You'll find something in the superhero that you do like. So let's talk a little bit about comics in general and the differences between comics. And like Solid said, it kind of tells you a little about price too. Okay, so this is a comic. It's our girl Spider-Gwen. So Gwen Stacy. I got this from my local one. And so originally it was $3.99. I don't know why I got it for $8, but I did. It was one of my birthday presents to me, so I don't even care. Which is good. This is why we're saying you go into this shop, and I'm just like, Gwen Stacy? Yes, yes. You know. But you can see that it is. Let me take it out for y'all to actually see her. Thin. Really thin.
I just
A lot of
want to
times
throw out
books
there
are.
real quick. Sorry, what she has, what they have in there is if you ever heard somebody say bag and board,
Mm-hmm.
that's what they're talking about. That
Yeah.
plastic bag and the whiteboard.
Yeah, it just helps to protect. This just happened to be how the first Spider-Gwen book was. I need to go find the rest of them, but I had wanted to start my Spider-Gwen collection, so I have to contact my shop and actually start a pull list of my own. But so you can see, it's made. It's all paper. It's kind of soft. It's kind of flexible, and it's thinner. So this is going to be your cheaper option. And what this is it's the first part of the story. So if you think about a comics run as like a big book or a big novel, here's your first chapter. And then we have, this is like a graphic novel. So what this has are a few stories. Thank you to Crimson for getting this for me a few years ago.
It can also be referred to as a trade, aka
Yeah.
trade paperback, and a lot of times that should be said that that's often like a collection. So sometimes
Yeah.
it could be like a lot of trades are often 6 books from a time period in
Yeah.
one location for you to have.
Yeah. So this is like going to be the first few chapters. This is the volume 1 of the Enlisted series. So these were special run that DC did with some of our favorite heroes, taking place and set in World War II. So when you're finding your comics that you like, you want to go and you want to find the issue number. So it's going to be somewhere on there. It's usually up in the left-hand corner. So this was number 1. This is number 1. It's good to start with your first one, just because then it's not confusing. It's like if you start a novel in the middle and you're like, I don't, what?
Unless you're trying to read something from Marvel, in which case they've had like a new number one
Then it
once every
doesn't
3 months.
matter. Then it doesn't matter, Marvel. And then this is our last option. Well, not our last option. Another option is called an omnibus. Now, omnibuses are expensive when you first buy it, but it does pay off. So this is the Batgirl of Burnside omnibus. Don't come for me. I like her. And the new Batgirl's costume looks a lot like hers, and I'm excited. So, this is an omnibus. So it says omnibus there. It's going to list all the folks who do it. An omnibus is the entire run. So this is the whole book. This is like the whole, if we were a novel, of the story of Batgirl of Burnside. It's going to have all of the writers, and it's going to have the whole story. And then sometimes it has like little a lot of times they have little extras in the back, like we were talking about her costume. That's some of the sketches and things like that with Babs for her new costume that she makes herself in this. You've got an omnibus.
Well, it's more like a compendium.
Oh yeah,
So for
yours
this
is a
one,
compendium.
yeah. So this one is compendium number 1 of Spawn,
Hmm.
and this one, if I remember correctly, has basically the first 50 issues of Spawn. Um, and the thing is, for all of these, is if you go and you read them, checking like the first few pages that list that has listings of what's
Hmm.
inside, they will list both hers and also in the trade paperbacks, they will list the actual comics that are inside the book. So this will again help you when it comes to, okay, am I getting everything? Am I
Yeah.
collecting in order? For example, one time when I started to collect, started to actually get into some books in the during Captain Marvel and the Jason Aaron's Thor run, I was also going a bit backtracking, and I picked up J. Michael Straczynski and Oliver Coipel Thor run, which was just following the comics event of Civil War when Thor came back to life basically, and so and each trade had a listing of the books that it was in it, so I was able to keep in order and keep going and following the story with very minimal gaps or issues. So this one will be one of those where it gives you information, helps you to find out what it is. And yes, this one was like $60, but again, 50 issues in one go. And since this is Spawn, who started off back in the early 90s, some of these issues you might not be able to find anymore. They're all just
Yeah.
in people's collections. Sometimes you might be able to find them for dirt cheap, but otherwise, some issues you will never find. So this is a great way, a resource to be able to get your hands on the books and be able to read them. Also, kind of funny, this one has Angela, the issues with Angela in it, and anyone who knows Spawn history and the issues with Neil Gaiman and Gaiman and Todd McFarlane, that's kind of a miracle that this is
Hmm.
that's in here.
Yeah.
So these are ways to basically be able to still get into comics, but at the same time try to be more efficient with your
Hmm.
money
Yeah.
because yeah, single issues can be $4, but sometimes issues involved in
Yeah.
events, they will actually charge more. So you're
Yeah.
instead of paying $4, you're paying $6 per issue. And a comic that's only like 20 something pages long, and depending on
Yeah.
how fast you burn through in a couple of minutes, that's gonna feel a bit funky. But $60 for
Yeah.
50 issues or an
Yeah.
entire storyline, like in
Hmm.
omnibuses like shown there, or Justice League Apocalypse War, that
Yeah.
can save you big bucks and
Like
make
in
it much
most
easier to deal with.
omnibuses start off around 100, but then you can wait a little bit and you can get them on sale. Like I got my Batgirl of Burnside one for about $70. And one of the reasons why I got that omnibus was because I've been having a tough time finding all of the Batgirl of Burnside stories, and that was the one that I started with, so I want to finish it. Um, you were talking about, what is it? Anthologies. So DC's done a couple of fun ones lately as they are getting to anniversaries. This one's all about Wonder Woman. I highly recommend it. So these are stories from Wonder Woman in her beginning all the way through till now, select stories that they put together. It's so good. I really, really love it. And then here we go. The Bat and the Cat. Um, if you like the new Batman and you want to know more about Bruce and Selina, this one's really cool. It goes from their actual first comic together in like 1939. And then it has ones that go all the way through to the back. And again, this one has some uh, extra art in it and things like that. So these are fun. I also love the floppies, Menachem. It's a little bit easier for me to hold than the big omnibuses. I have to put the omnibus down. But again, like I said, it was easier for me to find that. And I didn't know about omnibuses either. I found out about them on TikTok. TikTok actually has a lot of really cool comic content creators who will tell you all sorts of things to go along with some of the YouTube creators that you were talking about before.
Um,
Um,
an- Another thing with it comes to following what you were showing, which was like, for
mhm,
example, Batman and Selena, um, is that sometimes there are collections released that focuses on a specific creator or a specific creator's run. For example, Christopher Priest has one of the more highly respected runs in Black Panther, and so Marvel
mhm,
did put out the Christopher Priest collection, which I believe is 2 parts, 2 to 3 parts. So you can get all the Black Panther comic books that Christopher Priest wrote as they were published and put out there in one place.
Yeah.
Also, Walt Simonson, who did an amazing run on Thor. He's the guy who introduced Beta Ray Bill to the Thor verse, and he has a collection put out. And so there's several. There's also like collections for many of the Marvel's characters, so you can get like the first like 10 issues of Thor, the first 10 issues of the Avengers, and read what they were actually like way back in the original. Which, by the way, if you're reading the first Avengers comic, Wasp is a pain to read. It's so terrible. I'm like, this is so 60s, and I hate it because she's just googling over Thor way too damn much. It's like, dude, chill. But anyway, that's another thing. If you find a creator that you like, look up that creator, and chances are there is a possibility that there are collections based on that particular creator, especially if they are one of the more popular or famous ones.
Yeah. So we are getting lower on time, so I'm gonna kind of skip forward a little bit. And I want to say this. Enjoy what you enjoy. If what you're reading isn't hurting anybody, then you enjoy it. It doesn't matter if it's something that someone else doesn't like, if it's a run, if it's a comic book artist, if it's a certain kind of style, if it's a brand. Though I think a lot of people are kind of being like, oh no, I like this hero from here and this hero from there nowadays. Solid and I were talking about when we were growing up. There was a very like, I'm a Marvel and I'm a DC, and it was almost like you couldn't like both.
Well, no,
Um,
that's still exists. Yeah, it's
for some
still
people, yeah.
it
Yeah,
still
there
exists,
are
and
some
that
people who
was
are very diehard.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
No.
Um,
Mhm.
but also saying that if you're talking to a friend about a comic that you were really enjoying, and they're like, hey, this is kind of messing with my head, put that one aside, and you can talk about something else. Because comics are a reflection of our society. They are an art form. So there are triggering things in them. And it can be difficult for some people to always then consume that media. Um, there are certain comics I can't read. There are certain movies. And Harley Quinn. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot about Crimson was saying that she really loves Harley Quinn, but there's a lot that she can't always read her comics. And that is entirely fair.
First off, you tell anybody who gives you shit over Harley Quinn to go fuck off, because Harley Quinn was created in the '90s Batman animated series. Then she was brought into the comic books. The whole
Yeah,
thing of like, there is no gatekeeping for Harley Quinn. It's like the
yeah,
only gatekeeping that's viable is like, did you not watch the
hmm
Batman cartoon in the '90s? It's been
yeah,
on Blu-ray. Get off your ass. Come on now. It's on.
yeah.
I think it's also
It's
on
on HBO.
HBO Max. Let's go. Come on
I'm
now.
about to
So
start a rewatch of it because I need some comfort, and that Bruce Wayne is the Bruce Wayne for me. He
yeah.
is he is my comfort Batman. When I'm sad and I want Batman to be like, "You're okay," that's the Batman I think of.
Like the episode when
Yeah,
she got paroled and he's like, I
yeah.
had a bad day
Bad
too.
day too. I've had a bad day too once, and I'm like, yeah, Bruce, we've all had a bad day too once. Um, Yeah, like what you like and allow people to like what they like. You can say things like, I don't want people to talk to me about the Killing Joke. And I probably will never read Jessica Jones, but I enjoy Jessica Jones. Because of my own experiences and things that have happened to me and my triggers. Can't do it. Um, but we're all here to help an industry and to continue having these stories and these characters that we love. And at the end of the day, they need us. We're heroes too. That's corny, but it's true. Like, we all kind of have to work together to make sure that this industry continues because we have almost lost it quite a few times. So, this is one of those things where, as fans, we do need to take an active part in it. Hype up cosplayers, hype up artists, hype up folks in your communities that are doing cool things, that are creating content within comics. If you can go to your local libraries, if you can go to your local shops, do that. Watch stuff. Watch the movies. It's all valid. You are a fan, even if you're not reading comics. If all you're doing is going, and I say this very lightly because movies are expensive. If what you're doing is going to the movies, if what you're doing is paying for your streaming subscription so that you can rewatch WandaVision over and over and over again because you're a little salad, that's it. That's enough. You are a fan. End of story. So enjoy what you enjoy, lift each other up, and I understand that comics are a little scary, but we're all here to help each other out. So let's see. Does anybody have anything to say really quick? I don't see our next panelist yet, so I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, sort of piggybacking on the whole, the comics can have triggers. It's that I would say that again, it's also for parents, and a lot of us in here probably already
That's
realize
it.
what
Thank
these
you.
things are. But a couple of things for parents, yo, just because they are comic books does not mean they are for children. And this is sort of like we saw another version of this with the whole. There was some controversy around was it Turning Red by Pixar, where
Mhm.
people are like, oh, this is like too serious of topics we talk about with children. I'm like, motherfucker, just because animated does not mean that it's only children who watch this show. It's just a means to tell a story. Comics are the same thing. It's a means to tell a story. Okay. And even though we primarily are talking about superhero comics, there are still other comics. Oftentimes it is, the indie and the smaller publishers who are making comics that have nothing to do with superheroes whatsoever, but they are still enjoyable.
Yeah.
And so, don't go into expecting, a child's thing. That's a bit of a warning for you not to have the wrong expectations, but also warning to be careful with, in case something that you don't realize that would trigger you. Um, one shop I went to, they were talking about one day that a mom came in asking about Deadpool for their 8-year-old child.
Yeah.
Deadpool is not a child-friendly character
No.
at all.
I had
In any
a
way.
I had a kid come up when I worked at the library and I was on the main desk, and he had the Killing Joke, as well as a whole bunch of like these Batman animated adventures, like comics that had been put together specifically for kids that we had in the children's department. And I was like, oh, hey, is your mom here? I need her to give me the card. And he's like, oh, okay. And I'm checking, putting the books in the system, and then I slide Killing Joke to the mom, and I'm like, do you really want him to have this? And she was like, no. And I'm like, okay, cool. And I took it from her while making it look like I was scanning it and put it in the book return really quick. Like, he never knew, he didn't get it. It was fine. But yeah, talking about different ones, Rat Queens is amazing. A lot of us here are gamers. This is actual D&D. Happening with a diverse group of ladies. This is amazing. I think Crimson also got me this one because I had a bunch of these novels on my Ulmus list all the time. But yeah, there's a lot out there. There are a lot of indie groups, a lot of folks making things that are comics that are not even in superheroes. If you don't want to watch superheroes, that's great. Oh, but Jen is here. So I'm just going to wrap it up by saying thank you so much to all of you for hanging out with us. We really appreciated you. And Jen's here to do the panel, which is character building for TTRPGs and beyond. So speaking of rat queens,
So
get ready, gamers.
Yeah, make sure you follow Solid on Twitter. I don't know that you use your Twitter, Solid.
I don't
You
have a
would
Twitter.
like this,
Okay.
Jen.
I have Twitch.
Make sure you follow ThiaTheGard on Twitter and Those Meddling Kids,
Yes.
their podcast. And we'll be right back.